Peter Vandermeer knelt beside the glowing brick pit in his cabin floor, watching thermal energy radiate from stones that hadn't seen flame in 9 days. Outside, the Montana winter had already killed 2 trappers this month, but inside his cabin, the heat from a single fire still kept the air warm enough that frost never touched the windows. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more extraordinary than this one. The door to Nathaniel Groves's cabin stood partially open when Peter Vandermeer arrived on the morning of December 19, 1841. Snow had drifted against the threshold during 3 days of blizzard, and the silence from inside told Peter everything before he even stepped through the entrance. He found Nathaniel in his bedroll near the cold fireplace, frozen solid, his hand still reaching toward the stack of firewood that sat less than 5 feet away. Peter stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 7 Montana winters. A full cord of split wood lined the cabin's west wall. Nathaniel's rifle hung clean and oiled above the mantel. Dried meat and supplies filled the shelves. Everything a man needed to survive winter was present in abundance. Everything except the ability to stay conscious long enough to keep a fire burning. They had been partners for 4 years, working the beaver streams along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River. Nathaniel was English, from Cornwall, and had come west in 1836 seeking fortune in fur. He was competent with traps, reliable in difficult situations, and careful with his supplies. But 2 weeks earlier, he had developed a fever. Peter had checked on him then, brought him fresh water, urged him to rest. Nathaniel had waved him off, insisting he would recover in a few days. The fever had likely broken his sleep patterns, left him too weak to wake when the fire burned low. Peter spent the rest of that day digging a grave on the hillside above Nathaniel's cabin. The ground was frozen 18 inches down, and he had to build a fire on the burial spot to soften the earth enough to dig. By the time he lowered Nathaniel's canvas-wrapped body into the ground and covered it with stones, the winter sun was setting, and temperature was dropping toward what felt like 20 below zero. He returned to his own cabin as darkness fell, built up his fire, and lay down in his bedroll. But sleep wouldn't come. Every 2 hours through that long night, Peter woke himself to add wood to the flames. It was a rhythm every mountain man knew, the unconscious calculation of how long your fire would last before cold became dangerous. But lying there in the darkness, feeding split pine into the fireplace while exhaustion pulled at his consciousness, Peter realized something that would obsess him for the next year. Survival in the wilderness shouldn't require a man to never sleep deeply. Nathaniel Groves had frozen to death, surrounded by everything he needed to live, killed by the simple fact that frontier heating demanded constant vigilance. And Peter Vandermeer, staring at the flames dancing in his fireplace, understood he was one illness, one injury, one moment of deep exhaustion away from exactly the same fate. Peter had been born in Gelderland, in the eastern Netherlands, in a region where winter cold settled into the river valleys and stayed for months. His family had been modest farmers, working land that had belonged to Vandermeer ancestors for 6 generations. He had left for America in 1833 at age 21, seeking opportunity that didn't exist for a younger son with no inheritance prospects. But certain memories from childhood persisted, and in the weeks after Nathaniel's death, one particular memory returned with unexpected clarity. His sister Annika had married a tile setter named Willem, who specialized in building kachelofens, the massive ceramic stoves that heated Dutch and German homes. Peter remembered visiting their house one January evening when he was perhaps 12 years old. The kachelofen in their main room stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in beautiful glazed tiles decorated with blue windmill patterns. But what struck young Peter wasn't the aesthetics. It was watching Willem open the firebox door at 6 in the evening, load it with split oak, and tend a hot fire for perhaps 2 hours. Then Willem had closed and sealed the firebox, and the family had simply gone about their evening. Peter had asked his brother-in-law why he wasn't keeping the fire going. Willem had smiled and placed Peter's hand on the ceramic tiles. They were almost too hot to touch. "The tiles hold the heat," Willem had explained in Dutch. "The fire heats the ceramic, and the ceramic releases warmth slowly. By morning, these tiles will still be warm. We heat this stove twice a day in winter, and the house never gets cold." At the time, Peter had simply accepted this as normal, the way houses worked in town. But lying awake in his Montana cabin 15 years later, the memory took on new significance. The principle Willem had described was thermal mass, though Peter didn't know that technical term. He understood it practically. Certain materials could absorb tremendous amounts of heat and release it slowly over time. The Kochelofen worked because ceramic tiles, heated to high temperature, stayed hot for many hours. Peter had always dismissed such systems as old-world luxury, impractical for frontier life, where survival meant making do with simple tools and rough construction. Mountain men built fireplaces from river stone and mud. They burned wood constantly because that's what wood was for. The idea of heating something once and having it stay warm seemed like a fantasy suitable for comfortable Dutch farmhouses, but impossible in the wilderness. But now, feeding his fire every 2 hours through another sleepless night, Peter began thinking through the principle differently. What if you could build a heat source that stayed warm not for hours, but for days? Not a vertical ceramic stove, but something adapted to frontier materials and frontier needs. The more he considered it, the more the obsessive part of his mind that had kept him alive through 7 dangerous winters latched onto the problem and wouldn't let go. Other trappers dealt with winter heating in various ways. Some built large fireplaces that threw heat but consumed enormous amounts of wood. Some relied on small, efficient fires that required constant tending. A few wealthy trappers at established posts had cast iron stoves shipped from St. Louis, expensive devices that worked well but still needed regular fueling. Everyone accepted that winter meant either staying awake to tend fire or accepting the risk of cold. Peter began to believe there might be another way. When spring thaw arrived in late March of 1842 and the trapping season ended, he made his decision. He would travel to St. Louis, sell his winter's fur harvest, and return with materials for an experiment that would either save his life or prove him as foolish as the idea sounded. Peter reached St. Louis in early June of 1842 after 3 weeks of travel by horseback. He sold his winter's collection of beaver pelts to a fur buyer on Chestnut Street for $173, a modest profit that represented 7 months of dangerous work in the mountains. Most trappers who came to St. Louis spent their earnings quickly on whiskey and supplies, then returned to the wilderness within a week. Peter spent his first afternoon walking through the commercial district, studying buildings under construction. He watched bricklayers working on a mercantile building, noting how they mixed mortar and set each brick with careful attention to level and alignment. On his 3rd day in the city, he found what he was looking for at Pritchard's Building Supply, a large yard near the river that sold construction materials. Mr. Pritchard himself, a heavy-set man with spectacular mutton-chop whiskers, looked at Peter with undisguised skepticism when Peter explained what he wanted. "You want 300 bricks," Pritchard repeated slowly, "delivered to the keelboat landing for transport upriver to Fort Union, then overland by mule train into the Montana Territory." "Yes, sir," Peter confirmed. "Son, do you have any idea what 300 bricks weigh? That's better than 800 pounds of material. The shipping cost alone will be near as much as the bricks themselves." Peter had already calculated the numbers. The bricks would cost $42. Transport upriver would cost another $30. The overland mule freight from Fort Union to his territory would cost $25 more. Nearly $100 total, more than half his season's earnings. "I understand the cost," Peter said. I also need 50 pounds of mortar clay, a masonry trowel, and iron grating if you have it." Pritchard studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your money spends same as anyone's. You building something particular out there?" "A heating system," Peter said simply. Word of the Dutchman buying hundreds of bricks spread through the trapper community within 2 days. At Morrison's Outfitters, where Peter purchased his regular supplies, he encountered Cyrus Blackwell, a fellow trapper who worked streams about 30 miles from Peter's territory. "Heard you're hauling bricks into Montana," Blackwell said, grinning. "Vandermeer's building a palace in the wilderness. That the plan?" "Fire's free," Blackwell pointed out. "Trees everywhere. Why are you spending a fortune on bricks?" Peter considered explaining the thermal mass principle, the memory of his brother-in-law's Kachalufen, the death of Nathaniel Groves. But he knew how it would sound, so he simply said, "I have a plan that might work better." Blackwell laughed, not unkindly. "Well, good luck with it. If you build something that keeps you warmer than my fireplace, I'll eat one of those bricks." Peter arranged the shipping through a keelboat operator who ran regular supply runs upriver. The bricks were loaded carefully into crates to prevent breakage during transport. His other supplies were packed separately. The entire load would travel by water to Fort Union, then transfer to a mule freight operation serving the Northern Territories. The cost was staggering by frontier standards, but Peter committed without hesitation. He had watched his partner freeze to death surrounded by firewood. He had spent too many nights waking every 2 hours to feed flames. If thermal mass principles could be adapted to frontier conditions, the investment was worthwhile. If the experiment failed, he would be nearly broke, but no worse off than dozens of other trappers who gambled their earnings on various schemes. He left St. Louis in late June, riding ahead of his freight shipment. The bricks would take 6 weeks to reach his territory. That gave him time to plan the construction in detail and prepare his cabin for the modifications he intended to make. Peter returned to his territory in late July of 1842 and spent the next 2 weeks planning before his brick shipment arrived. He had carried the basic concept from St. Louis, the memory of Willems Kachalufen providing the theoretical foundation, but adapting a vertical ceramic stove to horizontal frontier construction required solving problems his brother-in-law had never faced. The fundamental challenge was thermal mass orientation. A Kachalufen stood 8 feet tall with fire at the bottom and ceramic tiles surrounding a vertical flue. Heat rose through the structure, warming tiles on all sides before exiting through the chimney. But Peter needed a sleeping platform, something horizontal that a man could lie on. That meant building the thermal mass underground and conducting heat upward, reversing the natural convection pattern. He spent hours sketching designs in charcoal on pieces of bark. His cabin measured 12 feet by 14 feet, with a stone fireplace on the north wall. He calculated that a heating structure 5 feet long and 3 feet wide would provide sleeping space for one person while leaving floor area for movement and storage. The depth was critical. Too shallow, and the thermal mass would be insufficient. Too deep, and he would weaken the cabin's foundation. He settled on 3 feet deep, extending below the frost line. At that depth, the earth maintained a relatively constant temperature of approximately 50 degrees year-round. This meant the bottom and sides of his brick chamber would be insulated by earth that stayed warmer than winter air, reducing heat loss in all directions except upward. The material selection was equally important. Brick had higher thermal mass than stone, meaning it could absorb and retain more heat per pound. The clay mortar between bricks would create an airtight seal, preventing heat from escaping through gaps. River stones would fill the interior cavity, adding additional thermal mass while creating air spaces that would slow heat transfer. Peter conducted small-scale experiments using his existing fireplace. He heated river stones to glowing temperature, then wrapped them in clay and buried them in a box of sand. He checked the temperature daily by touch. The stones stayed noticeably warm for 5 full days before cooling to ambient temperature. If a small mass in a wooden box could retain heat that long, A large mass in an insulated brick chamber might retain usable heat for 2 weeks or more. The sleeping platform design required careful calculation. Direct contact with hot brick would cause burns, but too much insulation would block the heat entirely. He planned a wooden frame that would rest on corner posts, creating a 6-inch air gap between the platform surface and the top of the brick structure. Warm air would circulate in this gap, heating the platform bottom while preventing dangerous temperatures on the sleeping surface. Other trappers passing through his territory that summer thought he was wasting valuable preparation time. Duncan McCrae stopped by in early August and found Peter sitting outside his cabin with dozens of bark sketches spread around him. "You spending the whole summer drawing pictures, Vandermeer?" McCrae asked. "Planning," Peter replied. "The construction starts when my materials arrive." McCrae shook his head and rode on. In 2 weeks, the mule train arrived with 800 pounds of bricks, and Peter's excavation began. The mule train arrived on August 12, 1842, carrying Peter's bricks in wooden crates packed with straw. He spent 2 days unloading and inspecting each brick for cracks or damage from the long journey. Of the 300 he had ordered, 17 were broken beyond use. The remaining 283 would be sufficient if he worked carefully and wasted nothing. Peter began excavation on August 15th. He chose a location near the center of his cabin, away from the existing fireplace but close enough to his sleeping area that the transition would be practical. Using a shovel and pickaxe, he outlined a rectangle 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, then began removing earth 1 bucket at a time. The first foot of digging was relatively easy, moving through topsoil and decomposed organic matter. The second foot encountered clay, dense and heavy, requiring the pickaxe to break it loose before shoveling. The third foot reached harder, packed earth mixed with rocks. Each bucketful had to be carried outside and dumped away from the cabin. The pile of excavated dirt grew steadily beside his door. The physical labor was exhausting. Peter worked from dawn until the light failed each evening, taking breaks only to eat and rest his shoulders. His hands developed fresh blisters that broke and calloused over. His back ached from the repetitive motion of lifting and carrying, but he maintained steady progress. And by the end of the first week, he had excavated the full pit, 5 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet deep. He had partially dismantled his cabin floor to accommodate the excavation, removing planks in a section slightly larger than the pit itself. These planks were set aside carefully for reinstallation later. The exposed earth around the pit edges showed the floor joists and foundation logs, revealing structure that had been hidden since the cabin's construction years earlier. With the pit complete, Peter began the brickwork. He mixed mortar according to ratios he had learned watching the St. Louis bricklayers, 3 parts sand to 1 part clay, with water added slowly until the mixture reached proper consistency. The mortar had to be wet enough to spread smoothly, but dry enough to hold the bricks in position without slumping. He started at the bottom corners, laying bricks in a running bond pattern with each course offset from the one below. Every brick was checked for level using a hand-carved wooden tool. Every joint was filled completely with mortar, troweled smooth on both sides. The work proceeded slowly because precision mattered more than speed. A gap in the mortar would allow heat to escape. An uneven course would create structural weakness. The brick walls rose gradually over the next 2 weeks. Peter worked alone, talking to no one, focused entirely on the construction. When Jean-Luc Moreau stopped by in early September and saw the brick-lined pit in the middle of Peter's cabin floor, he laughed out loud. "You tore up your floor to build a brick hole," Moreau said in French-accented English. "This is your heating system?" "The first part of it," Peter replied, continuing his work. Moreau shook his head and left, still chuckling. By mid-September of 1842, word had spread through the scattered trapping community about Peter Vandermeer's brick construction project. Trappers traveling through the area made detours to see what the Dutchman was building, and most left convinced he had lost his mind. Jean-Luc Moreau returned on September 20th with two other trappers, Baptiste Levesque and a younger man Peter didn't recognize. They stood around the brick-lined pit, examining the construction with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief. "So, you heat this once?" Levesque said slowly, working through the concept Moreau had explained. "And it stays warm for 2 weeks?" "That's the principle," Peter confirmed. "Fire burns, fire goes out," Levesque said flatly. "That's how fire works. You can't store heat like grain in a silo. Heat rises into air and disappears. Everyone knows this." Peter didn't argue. He simply continued working, placing river stones into the brick chamber. He had spent the previous week collecting stones from the creek, selecting each one for size and density. Larger stones provided more thermal mass. Dense stones without cracks would absorb and retain heat better than porous ones. He had washed each stone clean and allowed them to dry before placement. The stones filled the space between the brick walls, creating a solid mass that would absorb heat during firing and release it slowly over many days. Between the larger stones, Peter packed sand mixed with clay, filling every gap and air pocket. The goal was maximum density, maximum thermal mass, minimum wasted space. Duncan McRae visited on September 25th. He watched Peter work for several minutes before speaking. "You weakened your cabin structure digging that pit. Winter settles buildings. That hole might cause your whole floor to collapse." "I reinforced the joists," Peter said, pointing to additional support beams he had installed beneath the cabin. "Still seems foolish," McRae said. "And expensive. Those bricks cost you what, half your season's earnings?" "About that," Peter agreed. McRae shook his head. "I built my cabin in 4 days. Cost me nothing but labor. Works fine. Keeps out wind and rain. You're spending weeks building something that probably won't work at all." Other visitors offered similar assessments. The consensus among the trapping community was clear. Peter Vandermeer had developed an obsession with an impossible idea and was wasting valuable preparation time on a project that violated basic common sense about how fire and heat worked. Cyrus Blackwell stopped by in early October, curious to see the finished result. By then, Peter had completed filling the brick chamber with stones and sand. He was constructing the wooden sleeping platform, cutting thick pine planks to precise dimensions. "You really think this will work?" Blackwell asked, genuine curiosity in his voice, rather than mockery. "I think thermal mass can retain heat longer than people expect," Peter said. "Whether it's 2 weeks or 2 days, I'll know soon enough." "Well, I hope you're right," Blackwell said, "but I'm keeping my regular fireplace ready just in case." The platform took another week to complete. 4 corner posts supported a frame of planks positioned exactly 6 inches above the brick surface. The air gap would allow heat circulation while preventing direct contact burns. By October 10th, everything was ready for the first test. October 1st, 1842 arrived with clear skies and temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. Peter had prepared everything for the first heating cycle. He removed the wooden sleeping platform and set it aside, exposing the brick chamber filled with river stones and sand. The opening showed the full depth of the construction, 3 feet of carefully arranged thermal mass ready to absorb heat. He had cut a temporary opening in the cabin wall for smoke ventilation, a crude chimney arrangement that would vent combustion gases during the heating phase. Once the heating was complete and the fire extinguished, he would seal this opening. The air intake came from a ceramic pipe he had positioned to draw outside air into the bottom of the pit, providing oxygen for combustion. Peter started the fire at dawn. He began with kindling arranged in a pyramid pattern at the bottom of the brick chamber, then added progressively larger pieces of wood as the flames took hold. He fed the fire slowly and steadily, never allowing it to burn too hot too fast. Rapid temperature changes could crack the bricks. Gradual heating would allow the thermal mass to absorb energy without structural damage. He had selected only hardwood for this firing. Oak and maple cut the previous winter and dried for months. Hardwood burned slower and hotter than pine or cedar, producing more sustained heat with less ash. He fed split logs into the flames every 20 minutes, maintaining consistent temperature. By mid-morning, the fire had grown to fill the entire chamber. Flames rose 2 feet above the brick surface, and heat radiated in waves that made it difficult to approach closer than 5 feet. The bricks began to change color, darkening to deep red as they absorbed thermal energy. The river stones glowed orange where flames touched them directly. Smoke poured from the temporary chimney opening. Neighbors saw it from miles away. Duncan McCrae later told Peter that several trappers had assumed Vandermeer's cabin was burning down, and his experiment had ended in disaster. Peter fed the fire continuously for 8 hours. By mid-afternoon, his woodpile had diminished noticeably. He estimated he had burned through half a cord of split hardwood, far more than a normal day's heating would require. But this wasn't normal heating. This was charging a thermal battery. As evening approached, Peter began letting the fire burn down. He stopped adding wood and allowed the existing fuel to consume itself completely. The flames gradually decreased from roaring blaze to steady burn to flickering coals. By midnight, no flames remained visible, only glowing embers scattered across the bottom of the brick chamber. He worked carefully with long-handled tools to remove ash and unburned debris, depositing it in a metal bucket. The heat was still intense enough that he had to work quickly and retreat frequently. The brick walls glowed deep red in the darkness. The river stones radiated visible heat, creating shimmering air above the pit. By dawn of October 2nd, the glow had faded from bright orange to deep crimson, but the heat remained intense. Peter positioned his sleeping platform carefully over the chamber, using the corner posts to maintain the 6-inch air gap. The platform surface was warm, but not burning. He lay down fully clothed to test the temperature and fell asleep within minutes, exhausted from the long day of fire tending. Peter woke on the morning of October the 2nd after sleeping 8 uninterrupted hours, something he hadn't done during winter in years. The sleeping platform remained comfortably warm beneath him. He placed his hand on the wooden surface and felt steady heat radiating upward. Outside, the morning temperature had dropped to 32 degrees. Inside his cabin, the air felt noticeably warmer, perhaps 55 degrees without any fire burning in his fireplace. He began documenting the heat retention daily. On October 3rd, day 2 of the cycle, the platform surface still felt quite warm to the touch. He could hold his palm against it indefinitely without discomfort, but the heat was unmistakable. The cabin interior remained warmer than the outdoor temperature by approximately 20 degrees. On October 5th, day 4, the warmth persisted. Peter slept comfortably each night without additional heating. During daylight hours, he went about his normal work, checking trap lines and preparing for winter. Each evening when he returned to the cabin, the heat bed still radiated sufficient warmth to make the space comfortable. Duncan McCrae visited on October 7th, day 6 of the heating cycle. Peter had invited him specifically to witness the results. McCrae entered the cabin expecting to find a fire burning somewhere, but the fireplace stood cold and empty. The only heat source was the brick structure beneath the sleeping platform. "There's no fire," McCrae said, confused. "I haven't lit a fire since October 1st, Peter replied us. 6 days ago." McCrae touched the cabin walls, felt the warm air, examined the fireplace to confirm it was cold. "How is your cabin warm?" Peter lifted one corner of the sleeping platform, revealing the brick chamber beneath. Even 6 days after the fire had been extinguished, a faint glow was visible from the stones inside. Heat radiated upward in a steady wave. "The bricks and stones hold the heat," Peter explained. "They release it slowly. The earth insulates from below and the sides. The heat only escapes upward into the cabin." McCrae stared at the glowing stones in silence for a long moment. "That shouldn't be possible. But it is." Peter said simply. Word spread quickly after McRae's visit. Cyrus Blackwell arrived on October 9th, day 8, and confirmed the same phenomenon. The cabin remained warm, the platform surface still radiated heat, and Peter had burned no wood since the initial firing. By October 12th, day 11, the heat had diminished noticeably but remained above ambient temperature. The platform surface was only slightly warm to the touch, but sleeping on it was still more comfortable than sleeping on a cold floor. On October 14th, 2 weeks after the initial firing, Peter conducted his final measurement. The platform had cooled to room temperature. The heat cycle was complete. The thermal mass had released all its stored energy. He calculated the results carefully. One 8-hour heating session had provided 14 days of usable warmth. A traditional fireplace required constant tending, perhaps 16 hours of active fire maintenance per day. Over 14 days, that meant 224 hours of fire-tending labor. Peter's system required 8 hours total. The first snow fell on October 16th. Peter prepared for his second heating cycle, and this time 3 trappers arrived to watch the process and learn. December of 1842 brought weather that old trappers would talk about for years afterward. A cold front settled over the Montana Territory on December 7th and remained stationary for 9 consecutive days. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there, with wind that made exposed skin dangerous after mere minutes outside. Most trappers retreated to their cabins and focused entirely on survival. Keeping fire burning became a full-time occupation. Wood consumption increased dramatically as men struggled to maintain livable temperatures against the relentless cold. Those who had estimated their winter wood supply based on normal conditions began rationing fuel, burning less, and enduring colder cabins to make their stockpiles last. Josiah Mercer had established his camp 8 miles northwest of Peter's cabin. He was a capable trapper, 34 years old, with 5 winters of mountain experience. But on December 13th, the 6th day of the brutal cold snap, Mercer made a critical discovery. His firewood was running out. He had cut and stacked what he thought was adequate supply back in September. Under normal winter conditions, it would have been sufficient. But 6 days of extreme cold, burning wood at twice the normal rate, had depleted his reserves faster than anticipated. He calculated that he had perhaps 3 more days of fuel remaining, and the cold showed no signs of breaking. On the morning of December 14th, with his last cord of split wood stacked against the cabin wall and temperature still at 20 below, Mercer made a desperate decision. He would travel to Peter Vandermeer's cabin and ask for help. It was dangerous to travel in such cold, but staying meant freezing to death when his wood ran out. He wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned and set out at dawn. The 8-mile journey took nearly 4 hours, fighting through snow and wind. By the time he saw smoke rising from Peter's cabin, Mercer was approaching the early stages of hypothermia, his movements slow and thoughts clouded. He reached the door and pounded on it with numb hands. Peter opened immediately, pulling Mercer inside. The warmth of the cabin was shocking after hours in brutal cold. Mercer stood near the door, shaking, trying to understand what he was experiencing. The cabin was comfortably warm, perhaps 60 degrees, but there was no fire burning anywhere. The fireplace stood empty. No stove was visible, yet the warmth was undeniable and came from everywhere at once. "Where's your fire?" Mercer asked through chattering teeth. Peter gestured to the sleeping platform in the center of the cabin floor. "I heated it 4 days ago. It's still releasing warmth." Mercer approached the platform cautiously and held his hands near the wooden surface. Heat radiated upward steadily. He looked at Peter with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. 4 days ago? You haven't burned wood in 4 days, and your cabin is this warm? The heat bed holds thermal energy, Peter explained. I fire it once every 12 to 14 days during cold snaps like this. The rest of the time it just releases stored heat. Mercer sat down heavily on a stool, processing this information while his body slowly thawed. Josiah Mercer stayed at Peter's cabin for 3 days while the cold snap continued. He watched the heat bed maintain comfortable temperature with no additional fuel. He slept on the platform and felt the steady warmth radiating through the wooden surface. On the 3rd day, when the weather finally broke and temperature rose to 0 degrees, Peter demonstrated the heating cycle, building a fire in the brick chamber while Mercer observed every detail of the process. When Mercer returned to his own territory, he carried detailed notes about brick placement, thermal mass calculations, and air gap requirements. He told every trapper he encountered over the next month about Vandermeer's heat bed and how it had likely saved his life. Over the winter of 1842 through 1843, 4 other trappers visited Peter specifically to learn the construction technique. He shared his knowledge freely, explaining the principles of thermal mass and insulation. He showed them his sketches, described his material sources, and answered questions about costs and construction time. By the spring of 1843, 2 trappers had begun building their own heat beds. Duncan McRae, the former skeptic, started construction in July. Baptiste Levesque, who had mocked the idea as impossible physics, began excavating his cabin floor in August. The technology spread organically through the community, adopted by men who faced the same deadly winters and recognized the value of reliable heat that didn't require constant attention. Not everyone built heat beds. The investment remained substantial and the labor intensive. But those who faced the harshest conditions or who had experienced close calls with inadequate heating began incorporating Peter's principles into their cabins. Some built smaller versions. Some used all stone instead of brick. Some integrated the system with existing fireplaces. The specific implementations varied, but the core concept remained constant: massive thermal mass, careful insulation, and slow heat release. Over the following 5 years, the heat bed technology quietly saved lives across the northern Rocky Mountain trapping region. Historians would later estimate at least a dozen trappers survived winters they might not have otherwise, protected by heating systems that worked even when the men were too sick or injured to tend conventional fires. The fur trade collapsed by 1848. Beaver populations had been depleted, and fashion had moved away from felt hats. Trappers abandoned the mountains for other opportunities. Peter left in 1849, traveling to Oregon Territory, where he established a small farm near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1851 and built his farmhouse with an integrated heat bed system beneath the bedroom floor. His children grew up sleeping on warmth that lasted weeks, never knowing the fear of fires dying in the night. Peter Vandermeer died on March 7, 1879, at age 67, surrounded by family on his Oregon farm. His obituary in the Salem newspaper mentioned his farming success and community involvement, but made no reference to his innovation in frontier heating technology. But back in Montana, abandoned cabins with brick-lined pits remained, weathered but structurally sound. Prospectors in the 1860s discovered these structures and recognized their superior design. Some were reoccupied and maintained. The heat bed still functioned 30 years after construction.